Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about William Spaniel. Who is William Spaniel? Okay, so William Spaniel is a political science professor who focuses on interstate conflict, nuclear weapons, and terrorism. He uses game theory in many of his videos, and you can find him on YouTube. I like how he says, "I'm just a professor who studies war and game theory" in his About section. That's how I often start some of my videos. Look, I'm just a professor trying to provide context in the war in Ukraine. And we come from different fields, but his is political science. I study leadership. And so we come at things a little bit differently. Now, he's a little bit more speculative than I am. And I mean that not in a bad way, but in a positive sense of like what he's trying to do is predict, use game theory to say, this is what could happen. Where I'm trying to tell you, here's what's happened and here's why and here's what to look for, because I'm trying to make sure that I'm really, really grounded. It's not that he's not really grounded. He's just, this is what economists and political scientists are trying to do. They're trying to predict what's going on. And so it's a little bit more speculative than what I do for a reason. So we're going to look at one of his videos. And this reaction video, I'm going to let him go through it, and then I'm going to amplify certain things. I'm not taking it on like I would with Scott Ritter. I'm more amplifying like I've done with Vlad Vexler. Okay, so here's Putin's hidden weakness. He's only popular because he's popular.
What if I told you that Putin was popular in Russia because he was popular in Russia? Which equivalently means you could make him unpopular by making him unpopular. Confused?
Okay, it's somewhat like the Kardashians. The Kardashians are famous for being famous. I mean, if they weren't famous, what would they have going on?
Yet? Allow me to explain. We have previously discussed how, at least before the war, Putin was genuinely popular among Russians. That is, when 80% of Russians said that they supported Putin in 2015, they actually did. And they were not lying because they were worried about being thrown in jail or something to that effect. Well,
and I've seen the polls at the time. There was this very high approval rating of Putin, and it still remains reasonably high.
In a recently published article, researchers tried to get a better understanding of why Putin enjoys that genuine popularity. But please note that academia is painfully slow to publish anything. Thus, even though it hit a journal in 2023, the actual experiment occurred from 2020 to 2021. Oh, and this is social science, so they weren't using microscopes. The point is...
And that's a very normal thing in academia.
...is that we cannot be sure that this carries over to today with potential Russian rally-round-the-flag effects. But we will get to that later. Anyway, here's how it worked. Survey respondents were randomly split into 3 separate groups. One was a control group and received a simple question. On the whole, how much do you support the activities of the President of Russia? The second group received a little more context. That 2/3 of Russians support Putin, and that the support is stable. The final group received the opposite treatment. That Putin's 2/3 approval is historically low. There is also the only 2/3 framing, which I am sure would amuse recent American presidents.
Yeah, I mean, if these guys could get to 2/3, they'd be overjoyed. It would be remarkable if they had 2/3 popularity, and neither of them can get there. But that's part of the problem with being in an autocracy where, it basically you have only Putin as the only game in town. So that's a whole different problem set. Okay, so the framing is really interesting because here we have, the control group. Here we have the positive and negative. And so you're going to expect certain things to happen. And if they happen, then you've just proved what you already knew. And if they don't happen, something...
Regardless, there was no deception in this study. All of these statements are true. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea went off without a hitch, surging Putin's numbers into the 80s. Then, in 2018...
And before that, it was kind of lagging, because I've seen the survey data, and invading Crimea was an extremely popular thing in Russia for Putin to have done.
With the Russian pension system facing solvency issues, Putin looked for a way to implement reforms. But if there is one similarity between Russian and American politics, It is that you should only touch retirement benefits if you are into political suicide. There were protests. Putin made a plea in a televised address to let the reforms go through, to no avail. This is an actual still from that address, and you can see how he was not happy about any of this. The whole fiasco caused his poll numbers to drop into the 60s. And that is about where they stayed prior to the war, with...
And you can see that in the approval numbers. Just Google that and you can see that. Okay, let's keep going.
With the exception of a short dip during the height of the pandemic. Anyway, regardless of the prompt, all respondents had to indicate their support for Putin on a 4-point scale, though ultimately we are just going to look at the generic up versus down approval. It would not be surprising to see that the different framing effects change the survey results.
And that's what you would expect to see, right? So if you see something different, then you'd have to ask yourself, well, what's going on?
Form of something called push polling, because the respondents are being pushed in a particular direction. It is easy to see how this works in the extreme.
For example, let me give you an example of that. For example, if somebody calls you and says, do you support President Biden even though you know that the news has reported that he beats his wife? At that point, you're going to have a different result than if you just asked, do you support President Biden?
Example, if I ran 3 surveys, one that asked if I was a quality researcher, one that asked if he whose lines on maps once saved multiple countries from descending into war is a quality researcher, and one that asked if he who secretly feeds on human livers was a quality researcher, well, we would expect non-conforming results. Although the Putin polls are not as extreme, and again, only say true things, unlike mine because I don't like any of these, 2 of them clearly push the respondents in the exact opposite directions. And yet, that is not what happened. The researchers actually ran the experiment 4 times, but I'm going to focus on the 4th because its sample size was the largest. As a baseline, the neutral control group showed a 56% approval rating here. This is lower than what other polls showed at the time, but that is not the key point. It could be just because of different sampling methods.
But that is remarkably low for an autocrat who has basically no competition. So that's really interesting to see in and of itself. But let's keep going.
The important thing is that the negative treatment worked, dropping approval by 11 percentage points. Meanwhile, heading into this, we might have guessed that the positive treatment would have had the opposite effect, improving Putin's poll numbers. In fact, it did nothing whatsoever. And with more than 16,000 people surveyed, we know that it wasn't actually going up to the heights that you see in the background.
Okay, so now with 16,000 people surveyed, that means it's a very, very strong poll. Once you get past about 300 or so, you have a survey, a margin of error, about 3-4%, something like that. That's what a normal political survey like in the United States would have. Once you get up to 1,000, there's not really a difference statistically, not anything that you need to worry about, between 1,000 or so and 16,000. So it's 16,000, assuming it's a representative sample and not all just asking the same type of person in the same type of village or something along those lines. As long as it's a representative sample, that's solid.
Contrary, here with the details for the statistically inclined among us, we are very confident that whatever effect does exist might as well be zero.
Right.
Thus, push polling is effective in Russia, but only on the negative side. The other surveys showed similar null effects for the positive push, and consistent negative effects for the negative push, though not as big as 11 points. But remember that the last one had a substantially larger number of respondents. Now, the fun thing about experiments is that they can estimate causal effects. The respondents were randomly assigned which prompt they received. As a result, in expectation, each individual was no different than another. The only things that could cause variation in the responses were 1. Random noise, again very unlikely given how many people took the survey, or 2, the wording itself.
Mhm.
That's why we should be confident that the negative framing mattered. Nevertheless, experiments rarely can tell you why things are happening.
Mhm.
So, as this channel loves doing so much, let's switch over to the speculative side of things.
And as I said before, when he speculates, he's not doing this in a random or haphazard manner. He's actually using the tools of his trade and his profession in order to give us a sense of what might be going on. And that we found something different is really important. And he's described this really well. Spaniel has a very good sense, and I've not watched all of William Spaniel. I watched him early in the war, and then periodically I would tune into a video here or there. Somebody would email me and say, "Hey, have you watched this video by William Spaniel?" And he's been generally on point, and he has a remarkable ability to explain things. And there's a joke like, "Hey, I used to tell my colleague who was an economist, hey, for an economist, you're a great communicator." And I don't mean it like that. He's really a very good communicator. It's not just the backhanded slap of, for an economist. He's actually a political scientist, but he spends his time in game theory. Close enough. Okay, let's keep going.
There is a coherent narrative that you can tell that would explain not only the data from the survey, but some of the observable features of what occurred after the invasion began. It is no secret that the Kremlin dominates Russia's media landscape. And if the average person in Russia is only hearing good things about Putin, then both the positive and negative messages are essentially the same thing.
Okay, now did you catch that? So all they're hearing are positive facts. And I showed this last week. Ekaterina Shulman, she's a political scientist from Russia, who was talking about how what Russia is an information autocracy. It's a autocratic regime, but they're really focused on making sure the information is correct so that they can control through information, which is better than controlling through violence, but it's still control. And if that's the case, then it makes total sense that these two numbers would be lined up, because they're not hearing bad things, because the regime is not allowing bad things to be heard. So what happens if they do hear bad things?
In contrast, the negative spin provides new information, which then causes the drop in approval. It is a little weird that this occurs, even though the 2/3 number is consistent throughout. But let's go with it for a minute. The real question is why someone learning that Putin is on a downswing from others' perspectives would affect their own choice. Here's one way to think about it. Putin's domestic framing of international affairs is an us versus them mentality. That NATO has all along wanted to conquer Russia, that the fall of the Soviet Union was a great tragedy, that Yeltsin ran the country into the ground. But now Putin's oversight has allowed Russia to recover its great geopolitical respect. Moreover, he needs the support of fellow Russians, lest the West divide and conquer the country. If you buy that narrative and see everyone else supporting Putin, you might wish to also support Putin to present a united front, even if you don't necessarily like him. But if everyone else wants to see a change, then the united front is broken anyway, so it is time for you to join them and to move on to someone new. This is consistent with what we observed during Wagner's brief takeover of Rostov-on-Don. Everyone was quickly learning that latent support for the government was low, so more people started supporting Wagner. Then everyone saw everyone supporting Wagner, which caused more to want to unite behind the alternative. Another way to think of this is to run the original study in a cycle. If framing 66% as low yields an 11 percentage point decrease in popularity, imagine conducting a new study that began with the premise that Putin's popularity was only 55%.
And that's a really interesting concept. If you do this and cycle it down, how far can it go? It'll only go so far, because what we know is that this goes back to Ekaterina and what she says, like the oldest subset, and Russia's a pretty old country, like the 65 and older club, they really have imbibed all of Putin's rhetoric for years. They watch most of the TV, and so they're the solid majority behind him. The younger you are, the less that effect has taken place, because they're getting their information from other places. So it's only going to go so far, but it's a really great question, and I applaud William Spaniel for thinking through this.
Perhaps more fence sitters would now switch opinions, driving the approval rating lower.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you take that as the baseline, well, you can see where this is going. This is a frightening prospect for an autocrat. A major reason that popular uprisings do not occur is because would-be revolutionaries worry that their leader is popular and that their position is unpopular.
Mm-hmm.
So if they try going out to start a protest on a street corner, no one else will join them, they will have no safety in numbers, and security forces will arrest them. At that rate, they might as well be protesting all alone in the wilderness of Siberia.
Mm-hmm.
If latent support is indeed that low, then the government rests on a house of cards, which we know from Katy Perry is just one blow away from caving in. That does not doom the regime. Revolutionaries still have to coordinate, and that remains risky. Incredibly unpopular regimes can therefore remain in power, even when citizens are mutually aware of everyone else's frustrations. I imagine Putin is peering into North Korea right now to see how that works. It just puts Russia's regime on the precipice, one wrong step away from disposal in a backcountry outhouse. There were a couple more survey questions asked in the same study that I found intriguing. One was, do you like lines on maps? The other asked, is What Caused the Russia-Ukraine War a great book? And what do you know, 100% of respondents said yes to both questions. Or I completely made that up. I suppose you will never know.
And that's pretty funny, because he actually wrote a book called that, and it's on Amazon, and you can get it free on Kindle Unlimited, just like you can get mine free on Kindle Unlimited as well. So if you have access to Kindle Unlimited, please check out those resources.
Well, I guess you could get the book and figure it out for yourself. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will...
Okay, so here's my analysis of William Spaniel. I think he's a legitimate political scientist. There's no question about that. He explains things well, no question about that. He explains interesting things that help you provide an understanding of what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia. I think he has taken on some questions, and then he speculates a little bit, but his speculation is not loosey-goosey. It's actually using the tools of political science to help us project into the future what might happen. And so it's pretty solid as far as speculation can go. So I give him high marks. I mean, I think he's well worth watching. I'd urge you to go to his channel, subscribe, get whatever context you can from him. Every node that you have in your neural network is going to help you understand this, and he's a prime resource. I have zero issues with him from that which I have seen. All right, that's it for William Spaniel. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope that helps you understand more of what's going on in Ukraine. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you most of all for being the kind of person who cares about Ukraine.